Today is Wednesday, the 20th of June 2018, when the President of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, said that he would be dispatching a delegation to Addis Ababa and impart a response to the unfolding developments in the region, and Ethiopia's statement at the beginning of this month when it said it would comply with the final and binding decision of the EBC. This recording was carried out a few months back and is a detailed conversation and discussion with distinguished professors on the boundary question, rebutting much of the misinformation in the public domain on the implementation of the EBC decision. Professor Brilmeyer's in-depth and direct experience of the EBC and the process as an international lawyer, along with Professor Pratt's pragmatic perspective, has provided a true reality to the situation and information that can be utilised by policymakers to ensure that there is sanctity of adjudication and for the countries to move forward practically. Former United States Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 1989 to 1993, Mr. Herman Cohen, brokered an end to the Eritrean-Ethiopian War in 1991, refers specifically to potentially brokering relations today as between the two countries and, in his words, bad May in the morning and discussions in the afternoon. I'm also aware that US Assistant Secretary of African Affairs, Mr. Yamamoto, visited Asmara along with Ethiopia and Djibouti. In a letter to the Ethiopian government back in 2015, Lord Avebury, as Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Human Rights Group, stated, "It is tragic that Ethiopia refused to accept the EBC's decision on demarcation as agreed when the Commission was established, and doing so now would be a huge contribution to world peace. The alternative is a colossal waste of resources by the two states on superfluous military armaments and manpower, together with the forfeiture of the great opportunities for joint economic cooperation, such as access by Ethiopia to the ports of Aseb and Massawa, that full acceptance of the EBC's decision would enable Ethiopia to realise." And he went on to state that the notable achievements of Ethiopian Airlines could be enhanced still further by adding Asmara to its growing list of destinations. This recording is in his honour, his memory, and as a friend of Eritrea, and I'm deeply grateful to Professor Brilmeyer and Professor Pratt for their due care and attention. So, welcome. This is a discussion with distinguished professors on the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission decision, commonly known as the acronym EEBC. We will be discussing today, from the context of the region, the failure of the implementation by the international community of the EBC decision, international law, and the ensuing impact on peace and security in the region, specifically in the Horn of Africa. I am Ruby Sandhu, a retired senior lawyer and principal consultant with RS Collaboration Limited, which works in the arena of sustainability, mediation, business and human rights. We're delighted to have with us distinguished professors Leah Brilmeyer, the Howard Holtzman Professor of International Law at Yale Law School, and Professor Martin Pratt, the Director of Border Map Consulting Limited, which supports international boundary making and territorial dispute resolution around the world. So why is the EBC relevant and important now, other than it's 16 years since the decision and it's important from a legal perspective, the respect of international law, but also because of the impact it is having on the ground reality in Eritrea and the creation of what is in effect a constant state of alert, where sovereign Eritrean territory is occupied by Ethiopia in violation of the EBC decision. This means that national service has been instituted to become what has been termed as indefinite, as perceived by the Western press, but more importantly requiring longer terms of conscription than if there was not this constant state of alert. This is the reason that is often being used by the youth that leave Eritrea. It is my pleasure now to welcome the distinguished speakers, and if I may start with Professor Leah Brilmeyer. Professor Brilmeyer, can I ask you please to set the scene for the benefit of the newer members of the audience on the issue of the EBC, and specifically from a legal perspective? And forgive me if I may just ask first your experience in the region and Eritrea.
I first went to Eritrea in 1993, shortly after the independence referendum. I was involved in a number of smaller pro bono projects at that point, providing legal research to different NGOs, local government institutions, different government ministries. I did that for about 2 years, and then was requested by the Office of the President to work on the Hanish Islands case, which involved some islands in the Red Sea. And that was followed by a maritime delimitation of the southern Red Sea region between Eritrea and Yemen. About the time that the maritime delimitation case was winding up, the war broke out with Ethiopia and subsequently led to an invasion of Eritrea in the year 2000, and that was followed by a peace treaty that was signed in Algiers, which created the Boundary Commission, the EEBC. At that point, I'd been working for the government for about 5 or 6 years, and it was, I think, fairly natural, given my background in international law, for the government to request my assistance in preparing the case for presentation at the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Brillmeyer. So you were incredibly well versed on the ground reality in Eritrea and as a legal advisor to the government of Eritrea and on the EEBC. Professor Pratt, likewise, your experience in the region of Africa and interest in the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission decision.
Well, I don't have anything like the in-depth experience in the Horn of Africa that Professor Brillmeyer has. I am a boundary scholar and a boundary practitioner. I work on international boundary issues all over the world. And in Africa in particular, I have advised a number of governments on boundary dispute resolution, both on land and at sea. And I have also served as an advisor to the African Union Borders Programme. My interest in the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary started off as one of intellectual curiosity, but I followed the work of the Boundary Commission very, very closely during its course. But I'm not directly involved working with either of the two governments.
Understand, but your perspective on this work is more from a sort of pragmatic approach to looking at sort of resolving disputes on boundary issues.
Yes, I think that's right. I spend most of my time working on boundary dispute resolution, or more broadly, what I would describe as the process of boundary making, which is the process of establishing a boundary and then moving forward, trying to figure out what will make a successful boundary going into the future once the initial line has been established. And I think that's particularly the context in which I'm still interested in the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary, is trying to figure out how to make the boundary work moving into the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Pratt. You raise an important point of how to make a boundary work. However, it is important that we understand that there was an international process and legal decision with respect to the boundary, and your reference to making the boundary work must, of course, be within the context of the legal decision, which I know that you completely agree with. And therefore, I think it's important for Professor Brillmeyer just to give those of the audience the background and the bare bones of the Algiers Agreement and what we mean when we say the sanctity of adjudication, the respect of international law, and with respect to the EEBC.
There were a number of types of issues that were dealt with in the Algiers Agreement. The first part of the Algiers Agreement was in June 2000, which established effectively an armistice that brought the hostilities to an immediate cessation. The June 2000 agreement was followed by the one in December of that year that established a United Nations peacekeeping force, UNMI, then also the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission and the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission. The article that is of interest to us in this presentation is Article 4, which said that the EEBC would be established to determine the location of the colonial treaty boundary, and the decision of the Commission would be final and binding. The decision of the Commission was to be demarcated subsequently with the assistance of the United Nations Cartographic Office.
Thank you, Professor Brillmeyer. That is incredibly helpful. You've set out the key points. And what about the decision being without ex aequo et bono? It would be helpful to understand what this means. It's critical as I see constant references in the press today which is ill-informed on the matter. By that I mean references to what the local people in Bad may think. This was something that both Eritrea and Ethiopia agreed to when they came to the table for discussions, and for Ethiopia in any way now to revert to that consideration is in violation of that legal decision.
Yes. Ordinarily, in international law, cases of this sort, boundary cases, are decided according to legal principles. There is the possibility, however, in international law, that a case might be decided ex equo et bono, which means by equitable considerations and not strictly speaking according to law. The parties, Eritrea and Ethiopia, rejected that possibility explicitly in Article 4 of the Algiers Agreement. They said that they did not want a decision according to general equitable principles. Instead, they wanted a decision according to law. But that is the type of decision that would be made even if the parties had not explicitly said so. If they say nothing about it, it will be a decision according to law. It's only if the two parties request a decision according to equitable principles that a court or arbitration panel will decide that way. So effectively, the parties agreed to do things the way things are normally done.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Brill-Meyer. So to reiterate, the equitable considerations were rejected by Ethiopia in Article 4 of the Algiers Agreement. It is therefore not relevant to bring in considerations of what the local settlements in Badme or other territories require. Professor Pratt, this makes it difficult for you to put forward the pragmatic approach that you suggest, and back in 2006, when you reference a paper, A Terminal Crisis, examining the breakdown of the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary dispute resolution process.
I think I need to preface this with a couple of comments. Firstly, the article I wrote, A Terminal Crisis, there's a question mark after the word crisis. The phrase was one, I think, that was used in a letter from the Ethiopian government to the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission. So it's the assessment of a terminal crisis is not necessarily mine. It was an accusation by the Ethiopian government. My paper was designed to see if that was the case. My conclusions didn't necessarily go that far, but I did identify a number of concerns with the process in terms of where it would leave the two governments at the end of the dispute resolution process. I have a lot of sympathy with the process as it was defined by the two countries and implemented by the Boundary Commission. My perspective is that the dispute resolution process was established first and foremost to bring an end to a vicious and very violent war between two countries. And I understand why the two governments decided to go for the very traditional international law approach of essentially interpreting colonial treaties, establishing international boundaries, and excluding the ex aequo et bono considerations that might have been included. I also understand the need to have undertaken that as quickly as possible because of the context of a violent conflict between two states. The concerns that I raised in the paper and still feel today is that the process of trying to define a boundary based on interpreting what were really very vague boundary definitions from over 100 years ago over a matter of months is one that is unlikely to produce a decision that is going to be satisfactory to both parties. At the end of that process, it's simply impossible, I think, to fully gather all the evidence relating to the history, the evolution of a boundary that's over 1,000 kilometers long in a matter of months. And I know that was a frustration on the Ethiopian side at the end of the delimitation phase of the Boundary Commission's work. So that was one of my concerns about the process, in that for however good the reasons were for establishing it in the way that it was established, it led to a somewhat fragile boundary at the end in terms of the perceptions of at least one of the sides as to how the evidence and the history were evaluated. But having said that, that was the process that Ethiopia signed up to, and it is one that needs to be respected. But my perspective as a geographer is that having established that line doesn't necessarily mean that the line is set in stone for the future. And one of the things I would like to discuss is how the two countries might go forward to create a boundary that is going to work for them into the future, having brought an end to the dispute through the process that Professor Brillmeyer described.
Thank you, Professor Pratt. Professor Brillmeyer, it is critically important that any myths be dispelled with respect to the vague boundary definitions and potentially a fragile boundary. And before you respond to Professor Pratt's reference to the difficulty of vague boundary definitions and potentially a fragile boundary, can I ask that you please confirm whether it's correct, and as has been asserted by Ethiopia, that certain Eritrean territory was administered by Ethiopia?
No, that's not correct. In fact, there's a very substantial dispute about some of the areas, and I think as to some of the areas that Ethiopia is now occupying, there is no doubt whatsoever that Eritrea was administering. But if I could say a few things in response to Professor Pratt's remarks. This is actually not a poorly defined boundary. There have been, over the course of the 100+ years that since the first treaties were adopted, there have been several very high quality studies undertaken about the exact location of the boundary. The League of Nations studied the boundary and produced a map that is unmistakably the map that was endorsed by the Eritrean side. The United Nations undertook a study to delineate the boundary between Eritrea and Ethiopia in the early 1950s and produced a map that very clearly indicated where the boundary was. During the period that Ethiopia annexed Eritrea, which was about a 30-year period during which the Eritrean independence movement fought against the government of Ethiopia, Ethiopia repeatedly produced many very high-quality maps, including some with Soviet cartographic assistance. They used these maps for all purposes. There's no question about the quality of the cartography. There's American maps, there's United Nations maps, and these were endorsed by Ethiopia at all times. I don't think that there are many boundaries in Africa or probably in other parts of the world that are better defined than this particular boundary. Ethiopia is dissatisfied with the result of the decision, but that's not because of the vagueness of, it's not any vagueness in the boundary, it's because Ethiopia wanted to increase its territory.
Critically important point you state, Professor Brillmeyer, and one that I've heard before with respect to Ethiopia's campaign of laying facts on the ground, that is wanting to increase its territory. Professor Pratt, you made reference to a failed partition in your article, and do please forgive me, this is not intended in any way to polarize the discussions. It really is to address the campaign of misinformation that has permeated discussions on the EBC implementation, including the reference on the alignment of the boundaries between the two countries. In fact, what Professor Brillmeyer states must be disseminated to ensure that there is intelligent follow-through, and to address the misinformation campaign, that there was not clarity and that further clarification and investigation was required on the boundaries. And that was the premise of what Prime Minister Zenawi Meles in November 2004 said was the illegal and unjust decision, and that there were other considerations and that the boundary was not equitable on the ground. So your thoughts, please.
Well, as Professor Brillmeyer explained, the Commission was not asked to define an equitable boundary. It was asked to interpret 3 delimitation treaties from the late 19th, early 20th century, and that's what it did to the best of its ability, based on the evidence provided by the 2 parties. I'm sure that Ethiopia would not say that the boundary was as clearly defined as Professor Brillmeyer said, but in a sense that's irrelevant. The Boundary Commission did the work it was asked to do, and did it as well as it could in the circumstances. My criticisms were not so much about the work of the Boundary Commission, but a concern that the overall process would not necessarily lead to a long-term successful boundary. It was simply reinstating a line that in colonial times had been applied pretty arbitrarily through the landscape. The people who signed the treaty, it's clear, had almost no understanding of the geography of the border landscapes. There's one reference, I think, in one of the treaties to trying to leave the territory of the Kunama tribe on the Eritrean side of the boundary. But beyond that, there was no sense the parties understood the landscape clearly at the time, and that certainly the map that illustrated the longest central section is little more than a cartoon sketching out approximate alignment of rivers. So the original definition was very crude. Whether or not it evolved into a much clearer definition over the following century was a matter for debate before the Commission. But I'm not at all suggesting that the Commission did anything unjust or didn't do its job given the evidence that was provided to it.
If I could say, it's very unfortunate that the entire body of evidence that the parties presented to the tribunal has not been made public. Eritrea was very strongly in favor of making the proceedings more transparent, including by release of all of the documentary evidence, all of the pleadings, and so forth. I spent, I think, 3 years of my life studying this boundary. I think there's a huge amount of evidence that people tend people outside the process tend not to be fully familiar with. And Professor Pratt's undoubtedly one of the most knowledgeable people from outside the process that there is. But, for example, the reference to the cartoon map, the treaty contained a map. The map was a simplification, but it was drawn as a tracing from a very, very detailed map produced by Descheron. The Descheron map clearly shows where the boundary goes. The treaty map itself says that it's based on the Descheron map, so there's no doubt whatsoever about this. There's so much evidence about this. Now, we hear a lot about the problems with African borders, that they're drawn by colonial powers, they're drawn with straight lines, they're arbitrary, they cut ethnic groups down the middle, and so forth and so on. It's disputed whether Africa is actually worse in that regard than any other place in the world, but it's certainly said about Africa. The consequence of this observation has been that the African governments themselves said almost unanimously in the Cairo Declaration that they did not want to redraw boundaries to try to avoid crossing ethnic borders, that it was realized that this would be the cause of tremendous bloodshed. This is particularly the case in the situation of Eritrea and Ethiopia, that for several decades had been part of the same nation state, the state of Ethiopia. During this time period, Ethiopians moved into Eritrean territory. Well, there was no reason that they shouldn't. It was all part of the same country at that point. It was part of Ethiopia. for them to now say that they have a right to the territory that they moved into because they live there. Well, there's places that Eritreans live in Ethiopia, but they're not claiming those territories. If we start trying to redraw African boundaries in order to keep ethnic or national groups intact, it's going to be a very big disaster.
Thank you, Professor Brillmeyer. And the importance of setting out the clarity of the boundary from the Deschamps map, and critically and importantly, the unanimous support of the Cairo Declaration by the African governments that the boundary should not be redrawn. Professor Pratt, this dispels the observations and comments that have been made by certain elements of the international community on how Eritrea should engage on the Badme issue and on the implementation of the EBC decision. As Professor Brillmeyer states, opening up the boundaries and potentially the issue on Badme could open up to more bloodshed.
I agree. No disagreement with those comments at all. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that there should be any discussion of redrawing the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary, or indeed any other boundary that exists on the basis of an agreed boundary delimitation process, on the basis of ethnicity or even evidence of administration over a certain period of time, which, if that has been subject to legal argument and a decision has been made to the contrary, I have no reason to suggest that the delimitation process should be reopened. Looking at the boundary from the perspective of a geographer and a boundary practitioner, however, I do think that all states should probably try to think more creatively about their boundaries, thinking in particular when dealing with old delimitations as to whether they lead to boundaries which today work on the ground. And I'm thinking partly in terms of overall relations between the two states, but particularly the people who live in borderland areas. They're often forgotten in dispute resolution processes that international boundaries run through real landscapes where people live. In the case of Eritrea and Ethiopia, we're not talking about huge populations, but there are settlements close to the boundary. There are people who have moved freely across the boundary, farming in particular, the border areas, sometimes very close to where the boundary identified by the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission lies. And I would encourage states, and in this case Eritrea and Ethiopia, to look at the boundary that has been established and say, does it make sense today, in particular for the people who live in the border areas? Does it deny farmers access to areas that they've traditionally farmed? Does it cut off villages from traditional water supplies? Maybe it even divides settlements in two. Does it affect seasonal migration patterns, where you have groups of people who move seasonally to areas where they can farm year round? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then I would encourage any two governments to sit down and look at the boundaries that they've got and say, are there any adjustments that we can make to this line to make the boundary less damaging for people's livelihoods? Now, when I say adjustments, I'm not talking about major reconfigurations of boundaries. They're minor adjustments to a boundary, a few hundred meters, a couple of kilometers, and I would expect any areas that are lost as a result of those adjustments to be compensated elsewhere on the boundaries, so that there's no overall loss of territory by either side as part of the process. I do understand why the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, made a very clear declaration that inherited borders should be respected. But that doesn't mean that all international boundaries have to be set in stone and can never be adjusted by agreement for practical purposes to make the boundary work for the two countries and the people who are affected most directly by that boundary.
I think it's very important to keep in mind what the reaction of the Ethiopian government was within 2 or 3 months after the announcement. Actually, it was less than 2 months within the announcement of the decision. They started to move Ethiopians from central Ethiopia into the border regions. This was investigated at Eritrea's request. This was investigated by the EEBC. There was no plausible factual dispute that this was what Ethiopia was doing. A delegation was sent to the area by the EEBC. This was determined to be the fact. Ethiopia said, basically, go to hell, and they continue to move people in there. Now, if there are people living on the wrong side of the boundary, it's the people that should move and not the boundary. The two peoples, two countries, two states can't live together unless they honor agreements. If Ethiopia is seriously interested in having good relations with Eritrea, it ought to have a practice of honoring the agreements that it's made with Eritrea, because otherwise there's no point having a boundary adjustment, even if there's trade-offs in territory, inside adjustments, as you say, made. There's no point having an agreement of that sort, because agreements don't have to be honored. If Ethiopia wanted to have a consensual agreement, it would move out of the area and not try to use illegal occupation as a club to force territorial concessions out of the state that established its legal claim in arbitration. It's all well and good to say that states should be flexible in dealing with one another, but not in the context of an invasion of Eritrean territory followed by several, at this point, almost 2 decades of illegal post-delimitation occupation. It's simply not possible for states to live as equals and as worthy of one another's respect if they refuse to honor what they have said that they would do.
Thank you, Professor Brillmeyer. The laying facts on the ground is of concern, but what is also further concern is that people are being deliberately resettled in Badme and in violation of the EBC and international law. Also, why is it that despite my research in the academic forum, I can find no direct and clear reference that advocates the sanctity of the adjudication in this case? And importantly, Professor Brillmeyer, you state that there is no point in having boundary adjustments if Ethiopia continues to be in violation of the arbitration decision by laying facts on the ground, subversive behaviour, illegal occupation. It really does leave very little room to negotiate as between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So, Professor Pratt, it would be very unfair to ask for a response because, as you point out, of course you respect sanctity of adjudication. But as Professor Brillmeyer states, it is not possible to look at the practical aspects until you have respected the sanctity of adjudication. So how do we move forward in this situation?
It's very difficult to see how we move forward. I have to step back and say I completely agree with everything Professor Brillmeyer said so clearly there. All my previous comments were premised on the assumption that 2 states respect the existing delimitation. And if there has been occupation of areas post-delimitation by Ethiopians, especially if they moved there as a result of actions of their government, then clearly those things shouldn't be taken into consideration in terms of the possible adjustments I was talking about. I just want to be clear on that point. Moving forward is very difficult if we don't have that basic foundation of accepting the baseline, the boundary that was delimited by the treaties and then interpreted and clarified by the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission. Until we have that, I honestly don't see how we can get to better relations between the two states. So I would again echo what Professor Brillmeyer has said. There needs to be respect for the process established by the Algiers Agreement. Once that is done, that is when the kind of analysis of the boundary and consideration of how it can grow and be well maintained. Boundaries are sometimes described as the skin of a state, and just like real skin, a boundary needs looking after if it's to stay healthy. And this is one area where I have been concerned about Eritrea's position since the delimitation stage of the Boundary Commission's work, because the Commission was aware that in the demarcation phase that Ethiopia was not cooperating, and it was quite explicit in that criticism. The Commission repeatedly invited both parties to take a more creative approach to looking at the boundary during the demarcation phase. And my sense from interpreting the documents produced by the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission was that neither state was willing to engage or even think creatively with the Commission about demarcating a boundary on the ground that reflected local conditions. So I would just encourage, as far as possible, for Eritrea as well as Ethiopia to try and think about the boundary into the future as well as the impasse we seem to be at present, and think, how can we possibly make this better without allowing ourselves to be bullied, which I perfectly understand that criticism.
I appreciate your, Professor Pratt, your sensitivity and awareness of the arguments on both sides of this dispute. There is a problem with any proposal to enter into discussions, negotiations, conversations, whatever. You know, they say you can't be 50% pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You can't be 50% certain of the sanctity of the results of adjudication. Once the principle is abandoned that the delimited border is the delimited border, everything is open to negotiations. It's very much to Eritrea's advantage to have a recognized border that both states respect. It's probably less to the advantage of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has uncertainty and unsettlement as its favored outcome. Once you start to have conversations about, well, you could make an adjustment here, or you could draw a little loop to leave this church on the Ethiopian side, or something like that, I am sure that we would not have a boundary negotiated, signed, sealed, and delivered by April 2018 if we had pursued that path starting in April 2003. There would have been just as many new factors to consider, a little graveyard over here, a farmer's field that required an adjustment. This is, in principle, an endless process if one of the sides wants to have an endless process. And when you pursue that path, it requires giving up your stand on principle that the boundary, the legal boundary, is entitled to respect. This would have very much been to Ethiopia's advantage to simply open the delimited boundary. There would have been no way ever to bring it to closure. Eritrea is unfortunate that it does not now have respect from Ethiopia for the boundary. But the international community does know what the Eritrean position is. The Eritrean position is that the delimited boundary is entitled to legal respect. If Eritrea had entered into some kind of negotiations with Ethiopia almost 20 years ago, it would all be a question of which side had the greater diplomatic leverage, which side had the military advantage, which side had the advantage in terms of occupation of the contested areas. Political problem that Eritrea would not win and should not and does not have to win. I come to this problem with a prior background in international law. I see this as an international lawyer might see it, as well as seeing it from the point of view of the Eritrean government. This is something that is very precious to international law, the respect for arbitral or judicial adjudicated results. This Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary is, I believe, from my research, the first case in history of international adjudication where one side has been allowed to thumb its nose at the results of a judicial or arbitral delimitation. This is extremely dangerous to international law. The results are seen in the South China Sea. They're seen in the Nigeria-Cameroon decision. As an international lawyer, I regret this almost as much as I regret it from the point of view of the people of Eritrea.
Thank you, Professor Brillmeyer. You have once again made some exceptional, candid and important statements, and in response to Professor Pratt's concerns. It is, as you both agree, that it is critical to reiterate the sanctity of adjudication, and because of the relevance of respecting international law and our advocacy on the rule of law. Further, it is clear that other considerations that you refer to, such as the leverage available to one party, Ethiopia, including geopolitically as against Eritrea, meant that it was not a sensible, practical or realistic option to discuss reopening negotiations on the boundary, including adjustments and compensation, and specifically in lieu of Ethiopia's behaviour to date.
I'm not an international lawyer, but I work with a lot of international lawyers, and obviously it's a crucial part of the process of establishing international boundaries. And again, I find myself in agreement with Professor Brillmeyer. She's expressed very clearly the risks associated with one party not accepting the outcome of an established judicial process. And I don't disagree with any of her conclusions. I'm not here to argue in the alternative. I was simply trying to approach the issue in a way that tries to look forward and think through how do we get past the impasse that has been created if there is no movement on one side to where it should accept its responsibilities under a process to which it signed up. But if Ethiopia uses anything I've suggested as a means of trying to reopen the delimitation, that is where I draw a line and say absolutely that should not happen. And there is a risk that could happen, as Professor Brillmeyer said. I don't think it is necessarily an endless process, but I do think that the process of boundary making between neighbouring states entering into the process with good faith, which here is questionable, but if they are entering it into the process with good faith, yes, there could be ongoing adjustments to a boundary over time, if it's going to be successful over time. The alternative is to set the boundary in stone and say, live with it. And maybe that works in terms of geopolitics. It almost certainly doesn't work for the people who live in border areas, or at least it's that they may be forced to adapt to a line that is driven through a landscape which they have not considered to be divided in any way. And I'd just like to keep that as part of the discussion, but it's certainly not the key driving factor here in terms of the dispute resolution process and its outcome.
Thank you, Professor Pratt, and for your considered approach to ensure that there is respect of the adjudication decision first and foremost. Another issue is with respect to the delimitation and demarcation. My question to Professor Brillmeyer: Lord Avebury made reference to demarcation by coordinates as in the Iraq case. Your thoughts?
Yes, there's no technical definition of demarcation that requires that it be done in some particular way. For instance, many international boundaries travel through riverbeds, river channels. You don't put pillars in river channels. It's not necessary, and it's not practically speaking, it's not a sensible thing to do. Demarcation occurs according to the best method practical under the circumstances. The pillar locations, or the places where the pillars would have been placed had Ethiopia cooperated, are established. They're established in a very technically satisfactory way because of the existence of high-quality overflight data. There's no reason to think that the Boundary Commission's declaration that the demarcation is now complete, there's no reason to think that there's any legal insufficiency about their approach. And obviously, you can't write the law in such a way that it creates an incentive for one state to obstruct the demarcation of the ground. And Ethiopia is, in effect, claiming that they have the right to veto the results of the boundary process by making it impossible for the technical staff to build pillars. It just doesn't make any sense, and it's not what international law has ever required. There is no set of requirements that they have to be pillars, that they have to be such and such distance apart, that they have to be thus and such tall. You demarcate on the ground according to the circumstances that transpire in a particular situation. And the Boundary Commission has done, I think, a very effective, they've come up with a very effective and practical solution given the circumstances.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I reiterate your key point, which again needs to be clearly disseminated to elevate the current discussions which are taking place in the public and our media, that there is no technical definition for demarcation, and that Ethiopia's right to veto the results of the boundary process by making it impossible for the technical staff to build pillars is irrelevant, and that demarcation on the ground is according to the circumstances that transpire in a particular situation. Professor Pratt, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I do. Professor Brillmeyer's final comment was given the circumstances, and I think that's very important. And I agree that the decision of the Commission to describe the boundary as demarcated is a reasonable one, given that it was unable to gain access to the ground to put pillars up. It clearly intended to put pillars up as part of the demarcation process, and I think generally that is desirable. Professor Brillmeyer noted that you don't necessarily have to put pillars on the ground to demarcate a boundary, and that is the case in terms of, say, rivers or possibly mountain ridges where the line coincides with a visible physical feature. But traditionally, delimitation was the description of a boundary, which over time moved from being a verbal description to one with a list of coordinates defining the turning points of the boundary. And demarcation traditionally has been making the boundary visible on the ground. And again, looking at this from the perspective of the people who live in the border area, making the boundary visible on the ground is quite an important process, part of the process of establishing a boundary. Not many farmers in remote areas have access to large-scale maps, or even if they did, would be able to interpret them pretty well. So there is a role for making a boundary visible on the ground, and therefore it is often desirable to erect monuments of some kind to show where the boundary is at certain points along the line. In that respect, it is a little disappointing to me as a boundary technician to hear the description of the boundary as having been demarcated, because it removes that process of making it visible. But at the same time, the Commission, because it couldn't get onto the ground to put those pillars up that it wished to, was in a very difficult position. And by giving precise coordinates for where those pillars should be, based on, as Professor Brillmeyer said, high-resolution aerial surveys, I think that was a reasonable outcome, and I think it did complete the task that was given to it, even if, as a geographer, I have a minor quibble with the use of the term demarcation, but I understand why the Commission had to use it in order to conclude its work. I don't see any scope at all for saying that the process set up under the Algiers Agreement is not completed until pillars are put in on the ground, because the Commission gave very precise coordinates. You will find those locations on the ground to within a metre of accuracy based on those coordinates, and it's simply a question of getting contractors out there to erect monuments of some kind at those points. There's no scope for debate as to where those pillars should be based on the Commission's work.
Simply add that even under non-contested demarcations, there are many places where a boundary has been considered demarcated, although you could not visually see from one to the next. It's especially in rough terrain, it's very hard to place boundary pillars sufficiently closely that they're always mutually intervisible, and so that hasn't been satisfied. Even though ideally it would be nice to have that, that hasn't been required as a condition for demarcation.
Professor Pratt?
Yes, that's true. There is no, as Professor Brillmeyer said, there is no formal definition of demarcation. And I would consider a boundary demarcated when it is made visible to the satisfaction of the two governments. And that will depend very much on the nature of the terrain. There is no point in putting pillars every 50 or 100 meters in an area where there's only 200 people living. You have to consider the human geography and the extent to which it is necessary to make a boundary visible on the ground. If a boundary follows a river and the river has a clearly defined channel, for most practical purposes, you could say that boundary is demarcated without any pillars. In other areas, densely populated areas where there's a lot of cross-boundary movement, which two governments may wish to monitor, it might be necessary to erect pillars or even fencing to show the line precisely on the ground. There is no right or wrong method of demarcation. My perspective is the boundary defined in a way that is fit for purpose as defined by the two governments in the context of the human geography of the boundary.
Thank you, Professor Pratt. This conversation and discussion has clarified much of the misinformation that has been out there. Professor Brilmeyer, your in-depth and direct experience on the EBC and the process, along with Professor Pratt's suggestions, and I stress predicated on Ethiopia's respect for the implementation of the EBC, for a pragmatic perspective, has provided a true reality to the situation and information that can be utilised by policymakers to ensure that there is sanctity of adjudication and for the countries to move forward practically. It therefore leaves Ethiopia in a position to be held accountable for its actions to date and to ensure that it respects the implementation of the EBC. Thank you to our two distinguished professors. I am grateful for your time and the invaluable insights provided in this discussion.